Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little, and I'm here today with the 15th episode of Weekly Poker Hand. And today I'm going to be reviewing a hand that was played in a $1,500 buy-in World Series of Poker event. So, not necessarily a big event, not a tiny event, but, you know, it's something. So the blinds are 50 and 100. I have ace-10 suited in the cutoff seat. So player in middle position raises a 300, and a player also in middle position, the low jack seat, decides to call. So with ace-10 suited with 90 big blind stacks, that is the effective stack size, I think you could go either way in this spot. I think folding's out of the question. Our hand's going to flop way too well. And I think your decision to 3-bet or call depends a lot on what you expect your opponents to do and how you expect them to react. If you expect to get called by a lot of inferior hands because you think your opponents are just not very good at poker, then I'm fine with re-raising to something like 1,000. I think that's going to give you some amount of pre-flop fold equity, and also, if you get called, it'll often be by marginal hands that were not good enough to 4-bet. However, if you expect your opponents to 4-bet with a relatively concealed 4-betting range, meaning they're going to be 4-betting with stuff like King 5 suited and pocket aces, then you really don't want to 3-bet, because you certainly don't want to 3-bet whenever you have ace-10 suited and get 4-bet. So I'm probably going to tend to call against the average player, but if I know something about my opponent, then I am certainly going to be much more inclined to re-raise. And then everyone else folds. So we see a flop with 3 players. The flop comes King 10-5, 1 heart, which is marginal. It checks to the caller. So the initial raiser checked, which usually means the initial raiser does not have a king or better, or that the initial raiser has an extraordinarily good hand, like pocket kings. The second guy bets, and when the second guy bets, that's always interesting because I don't think his bet means nearly as much as if the initial player bet. Well, I think the initial player is going to continuation bet a lot, but at the same time, when the initial player looks weak, the second player sort of has the initiative in it. They can just bet with all sorts of stuff because I don't have to have a king, and the initial raiser probably doesn't have a king. So I think that a lot of players in this guy's situation will be betting with a fairly wide range of just stuff, stuff that has equity, like ace-jack and jack-9 and just marginal hands. So gut shots, pairs. I'm not saying he'll not bet with a king. He'll certainly bet with a king as well, but I could easily see him betting with a lot of worse hands. So in this scenario, I don't really think I should fold. I think folding's out of the question. And I'm not really a big fan of raising, because if I raise, I think that will force my opponent to only call with mostly better hands than mine. And whenever you make a raise, you want your opponent to call with a lot of worse hands when you're value betting. And my raise would effectively be a value bet. I don't think I'm bluffing if I raise. Although maybe he'll fold out King 2 or something if he happens to have King 2 suited. But I don't think I'm making too many better hands fold. So I call the initial raiser folds, which is fantastic. It's worth noting that if I called and the initial raiser called, I would expect the initial raiser to have a middle pair a lot of the time, something like pocket jacks, pocket queens, maybe ace-10 as well, maybe king 10, or something like that. The turn comes. Looks like my replayer messed up a bit. I apologize for that. The turn's a 6 of spades, and my opponent bet 1,000. And at this point, it's sort of the same situation as the flop. The turn doesn't change anything unless he had exactly 6-5. I don't think he has king 6 too often, or anything else with a 6. Maybe he could have pocket 6s. But he bet 1,000 on the turn. So he bet 1,000 into the 2,000 chip pot, so half pot. And that's the spot where I think I can call again. I'm not thrilled to call, but at the same time, my hand still is pretty good. If it was good on the flop and I thought my opponent would bluff a lot, it's probably good on the turn too. And you have to realize my hand looks a lot weaker than it is because my opponent probably expects me to raise the flop with a lot of kings. So that means I have at best maybe a 10. Or I would have a king here as well, but who knows what my opponent's expecting. This is a generic opponent. But I think most opponents would expect you to raise with your best hand. So because of that, I think he's not going to think I have a great hand. So if he doesn't think I have a great hand, and he's still betting, it means he's probably trying to get me to fold that marginal hand. Because it's really hard to get value if your opponent just doesn't have anything. If he thinks I just don't have very much, then he probably doesn't want to be betting too often. Probably a better line for him would be just to check the turn and then value bet the river. I think that would lead to much more money because I'm definitely going to call the river bet with a wide range, but I'm probably not going to call a turn plus a river bet. So anyways, I called. River's a 2 of clubs, and my opponent checks. So at this point, I have to ask myself, is there any value in betting? And I don't know. It's a dicey one. I think most of the time my opponent's going to show up with either a marginal king, like king 9, maybe king jack if he decided to be a little bit passive on the river, or he's going to have a 10, which I beat all the 10s, or he's going to have a busted draw. So if he has a busted draw, he's never going to call my bet. If he has a 10, will he call a reasonable bet, like 1,500? And I think the answer is maybe. If he has a king, the problem is he's never folding to any bets. So I think if I bet, it definitely needs to be on the small side. But at the same time, I think I'm just happy to roll over my hand here. I don't love it, and I feel like we may be leaving a little bit of value on the table. But in tournaments, you have to be careful whenever you're value betting. Normally, when you're value betting in a cash game, for example, you need to be good 50% of the time or more when you get called. But in tournaments, especially once the pots start to get large, and this is a fairly large pot. The pot's 4,000. I only have 7,000 left. You want to make sure you're getting called a little bit more than 50% of the time, because the chips you win are worth less than the chips you win. Or, sorry, the chips you lose are worth more than the chips you stand to win whenever you do make a value bet in a tournament. So I'm not really sure if I'm going to be getting called too often by a random 10. Of course, if my opponent thinks I'm crazy, like say he thinks I'm going to be calling the flop with ace-jack, calling the turn, and then betting the river, I should probably make a bet on the river. But against most players who are fairly straightforward, fairly weak, I think they're going to end up folding on the river. And that's going to mean that I'm pretty much only getting called when I'm beat. And I do think I could conceivably be beat by king jack, maybe king queen, and king 9. So I think checking behind is probably ideal. But I could definitely be swayed either way in this situation, depending on what I think about my opponent. And sure enough, he had king queen. So I'm happy I didn't bet, but you have to recognize that just because the guy had king queen does not mean that I made the right decision on the river. If I thought he had king queen, king jack, and king 9, but then also ace 10, queen 10, jack 10, 10 9, and 10 8, and I thought he would call a small bet with all of those, I should probably still go ahead and make a bet. But I suppose in this exact moment, I thought the guy could have a king a decent amount of the time, and of course he's never folding it. So I guess I saved a little bit of money. You have to be careful on the river when value betting. I guess that's what this hand boils down to. You have to be aware of what your opponent likely has and how he will play his marginal hands. And in this scenario, I probably thought my opponent would check with a king on the river to try to get me to bluff. Because if he bet, he probably thought that I would fold most marginal made hands, like a 10 or worse, which maybe I would, maybe I wouldn't. But I would certainly fold out queen jack, right? For the straight draw that missed. So if he thinks I have a lot of hands like queen jack, ace jack, jack 9, and hands that we're just trying to get out of line, then he should definitely check the river, because that's the only way he's going to get any more money. Because if he checks and I bet, he can easily call, and he just induced a very nice bluff. So I actually like the way my opponent played his hand. I think he should have called pre-flop. I think he should have bet the flop. The turn, I probably would have bet it like he did for value / protection. And then on the river, I like his check, so a very well-played hand by my opponent. If you're constantly playing in poker tournaments, if you're constantly playing in poker tournaments where you aren't really seeing your opponents make mistakes, it's probably not a very good game to be playing. And you need to perhaps find weaker games, find weaker opponents, and make a point to play with players who play poorly. And in this hand, I think my opponent played really well. And he got a bit unlucky that I didn't value bet the river, but I like his bet. I like his check on the river. I think it's going to induce a bet for me a lot of the time whenever I have almost no value. So nice play by him. And yeah, it's a pretty crappy spot for me. And poker tournaments are hard when you make a lot of middle pair hands. When you make a lot of middle pairs, it's probably not going to go too well for you. That's going to be it for today. I thank you guys for watching. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. I'm more than happy to answer any questions. Post them in the comments section on this blog or in this podcast at jonathanlittlepoker.com. And I will answer in a very timely manner. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I will talk to you next time. This has been Jonathan Little for Weekly Poker Hand.